everybody. My name is Whitney Wells, and I am doing my Proseminar presentation on an instructional strategy, specifically student-led discussions, which I use in my 9 through 12 language arts class. Our agenda for today is first to talk about the strategy itself, and then the impact, my future goals, and the alignment to the theme of textured teaching. So first of all, a description of the strategy. To me, when I say student-led discussions, that means that students are coming prepared with questions to guide their discussion instead of me providing those questions. It also means that there is a free-flowing conversation. Nobody has to raise their hands. They just contribute when they need to. And there's very little facilitation from me. I also look for connections to the content. So whatever it is that we're discussing, I want students to use text evidence and be interacting with that. And I also want them to be making connections to their own lives for relevance. My goals with this strategy are, first of all, a classroom community and a democratic classroom. So my priority is to create a classroom community where students are comfortable taking risks and supporting each other, and a democracy where they feel like they have a voice and choices. I'm also looking for participation from all. The more active they are in the learning process, the better they're going to learn. I'm looking for skill development like listening, contributing opinions, disagreeing with others appropriately, a focus on content, and a social and emotional learning focus. That social and emotional learning focus is something that's been especially important in our district the last few years, and we've often referenced this diagram, which I feel connects really well with my strategy. So when I'm teaching discussion skills, students are also learning about how to manage themselves, how to be aware of themselves, how to be aware of others in the discussion. And so I feel like that connects really easily. I chose this particular strategy to give my presentation on because of several connections to the grad program. So the first course that I took was Culture and Language Acquisition, and one of the books I read was by Beverly Daniel Tatum called Why Do All the Black Children Sit Together in the Cafeteria? And it was one of the main points, or one of the main lessons that I took away from that, was that we have to be willing to talk about tough subjects such as racism. We can't shy away from those things. And so I've found discussion to be especially important in my classroom ever since then. I also took a class on active engagement and brain compatible learning, where we focused on total participation techniques. And that has to do with getting all students involved in being active learners. And I feel like discussion is a great way to do that. I did a field experience for instructional coaching, and the teacher that I worked with wanted to focus on discussions. So there was a connection there as well. In my ethical issues course, we talked about democratic classrooms, and I saw a lot of connections to discussion. And finally, I see several overlaps between our pro-seminar theme of textured teaching and discussions. So when I start to use this strategy, I go through a few steps to set students up for success. These are the things that I've found that work really well for me. So we first create norms, then I do a little bit of modeling and some lessons on creating questions. We practice in small groups so that they can get the hang of it before we do a large group discussion, and we always make time to reflect at the end. So I'll talk a little bit more about each of these on the next few slides. When we create norms, this is a way for me to give students a voice and some ownership in the process. I always start by asking them to define what an effective discussion is and what active listening is. Then they come up with their norms, such as things like keeping an open mind, using eye contact, inviting others to the discussion, and so on. That's when we get into our fishbowl modeling. And so fishbowl is where a small group of students are having a discussion and the others are watching and observing and taking note of what's being done well and what is an area for growth. So there's an article that I found that explains it really well. It's an engaging and student-centered strategy that builds comprehension of complex texts while developing group discussion skills. And observations from students are what provide insight into what makes for effective small group discussions. So this is something I always do so that they have an idea of what I'm looking for by the time we're ready to engage in discussion. I also do a lesson on how to create good questions. So I typically give students some printable resources like the one listed on the left side of the screen here, so that this gives them some starting points of what to ask, and they can even use it during the discussion to help them know how to respond to a peer. And then I also spend some time talking about factual versus interpretive questions. I don't want them to come prepared to the discussion with factual questions because those are easily answered. There's only one right answer and it can be found right in the text. Whereas interpretive questions are more open to opinion, and I want them to dive deeper into discussion with those sorts of questions. Once we've done all that front loading, we are ready to try a student-led discussion in small groups. I've found that groups of 4 to 6 work really well, and I group them differently depending on the class makeup. Sometimes I group them, especially at the beginning, based on comfort zone. If they are with their friends, they're more likely to speak up and be willing to take a risk. Sometimes I group them by ability, so I don't want one student who's really great at discussion to run over the others who might be more quiet. And sometimes I group by diversity of thought, so I know that certain students will bring different things to the table and I want them to hear all of those perspectives. And the bullet point that says "and more" really just means that you need to know your classes and play with the groups to see what works. Once they've had a few opportunities to practice small group discussions, then we give large group discussions a try. And depending on the group, there sometimes needs to be a lot of scaffolding to get to the point where it can truly be student-led, not teacher-facilitated, and free-flowing conversation. Some things I've done to scaffold in the past include yarn. If you look at the picture on the left, we use a ball of yarn to create a spider web, which is a visual of who has spoken, who might still need to speak, and they also are holding that ball of yarn when they're the speaker, so it's a little bit of a visual as well. The stress ball works in much the same way, and I've also used some of those total participation techniques to help us scaffold. One of those is called a bounce card, which is a sheet of paper that they can take with them into the discussion that has different sentence starters and reminders for them as far as how to contribute or add on to what a peer said. So all of those things help us as we scaffold our way up to a full group, completely student-led discussion. We always end with a reflection too. I typically do an anonymous reflection that covers both their thoughts on their individual performance and on the group performance. And this has led to excellent student voice and choice and ideas that I would not have thought of. For instance, there was one class that asked me to compile questions ahead of time from student submissions so that they could look at the questions and be a little bit more prepared ahead of time before the discussion. And that worked really great for that group, but it's something I would not have thought of if they hadn't given me that suggestion. So all of the things I just mentioned are what have worked really well for me, including the norms, the fishbowl, the scaffolding, those bounce cards, and the reflection. What has not worked so well in the past is early in the year discussions. It's really important that that classroom community is built. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a discussion where students are reluctant to participate and it's really quiet. I've also found that starting with the large group discussions and skipping the small group discussions doesn't work well either. Students need that small group interaction to practice their skills and get comfortable with their peers before they're ready for a large group discussion. I've also had some struggles with the logistics for small groups. I typically want to hear each small group speak individually. And so finding something to do for the rest of the class to do while I'm listening to that small group and finding an area where we can have those small group discussions outside of the classroom where students don't feel like they're being listened to by other peers has been a little bit of a logistics struggle for me. And then finally, I have tried in the past to skip the lesson on question preparation, assuming that students could prepare thoughts and questions for a discussion. And I've found that I can't skip that. They definitely need that preparation. Next, we'll move into the impact. So the first slide that I have here is actually the data from the instructional coaching field experience I did as one of my Viterbo courses. I worked with a science teacher in our building, and we shared a group of ninth graders, and she was asking them to debate and discuss science issues, and I was having them discuss a novel. So we got together to compile our data before we went through the whole process of the modeling and the fishbowl and the norms, and then our final data at the conclusion of the unit. So as you can see, the active listening skills really improved for students, as did the use of evidence to support their thoughts. And our greatest success was just in the overall participation that went from 39% to 98%. We defined active participation as speaking up and contributing to the discussion. I also included some of those anonymous student reflections on this strategy. And as you can see, students thought that they came prepared with things to talk about. They covered a lot of topics, and they did a good job of connecting the book that we were discussing to their own lives. And I also liked this one about how they feel comfortable talking. My own interpretations of the outcomes are that I've seen a lot more engagement from students in terms of their body language and their participation. I've seen a growth in empathy and reassurance. As students share things that are really personal, others jump in to support them. And as quieter students work up the courage to speak up, I've seen a lot of other students reassure them. I've also personally been able to get a much better gauge of student understanding by listening to them talk about the content, and I've seen them interact more with the content and the texts that we are working with in class. So in the future, I have several goals and plans. The first one being that I just want to continue using this strategy with novels and articles in my 9th and 10th grade English classes. And I think it's worth noting that this is applicable to any age or content area. It just might have to be scaffolded a little bit more for younger grades. I also want to think about my grading practices. Right now, I use a rubric to assess students, and I assess them in terms of their participation, their active listening, their text evidence usage, but I'm not sure that I love how I'm doing that. It's a total points system, and I'm moving into standards-based grading, so I need to rethink that and perhaps revamp my rubric. I also want to reflect on those logistics that I mentioned. So figuring out how to listen to a small group of students while keeping my other students on task, and making sure that we have an area where students feel like they can speak up without being listened to by the rest of the class. And finally, I see some areas where maybe this discussion strategy could be used to build partnerships with families. For instance, as we discuss literature, maybe families could engage with that literature as well, and we could bring parents and family members in to talk. That's just one of the ideas that I have, and one of the connections to textured teaching, which is our next topic here. So I was fortunate enough to see the author of the textured teaching book speak at a conference. And this quote is from something she shared in her presentation. So it says, textured teaching is a framework merging empathy building with skill development. And I feel like that connects so well to this strategy. By teaching discussion skills, we're not only teaching listening and how to share your opinion and disagree with someone appropriately, but we're also building skills in terms of comprehension and text evidence usage. And then there's that empathy building piece where students are learning to interact with each other. They're able to see other students' perspectives, and they are supporting each other in a discussion. There's some other connections I've seen as well. So in my synthesis essay, I talked about democratic classrooms and how I saw that as a theme throughout all of the 4 texts that I read. I think that student voice and choice and relevant learning are all important to textured teaching, and those things are possible with our development of norms and our student-led discussions. I also think by the nature of this being student-led that it becomes more culturally responsive because they can share their own stories and life experiences. I also made a connection to the Refugee High book that I read by Ellie Fishman, where she talked about providing windows for students to see other perspectives. And I think that by allowing students to prepare their own questions and thoughts for discussion, they're not only being given a mirror to see how the book or the content reflects their own lives, but they are being given a window to see what their peers think. The listening skills are also important. In the Just Schools book that we read, the author talked about listening to understand and not to respond, and that's a focus of mine in teaching this discussion strategy. And then finally, I read a book about rural education in America, and the authors talked about being curious, because even if we've known someone forever, we don't always know what their life experience looks like. And I think that that's another thing that can be accomplished through the discussion strategy. So these are my references. I have a couple slides of those. I used the 4 texts from our synthesis paper, as well as things from